Well, our next speaker is Dr. Jonathan Shanklin. He has a wide range of interests from astronomy, botany, cricket, and running Zoom meetings for his local Natural History Society. Today, he'll be focusing on botany, but don't be surprised. Well, he's told me to tell you this, but don't be surprised if there is the occasional digression. So over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Astrid. So I'm going to be speaking this time on declining arable plants. And I suppose the first thing to do is make a few acknowledgements, because everybody puts the acknowledgements at the end. I'm putting them at the beginning. So I've sneaked many illustrations from the wonderful BSBI plant atlas. I've used the DDB to provide some distribution maps and other information. Google AI has provided some useful definitions, and this paper this talk is based in part on a paper that I've written for our local natural history journal, Nature in Cambridgeshire. And I've sneaked images from a few other places as well. So the first thing is defining what is an arable plant. And Google tells me that arable plants are wildflowers that grow in cultivated areas, such as arable fields, where crops are grown for food. They are able to establish themselves in the short growing season of arable crops. And I thought, well, typical plants like that, groundsel, shepherd's purse, they're fairly typical arable plants. So where do they grow? Well, they're pretty much ubiquitous across England. And so this is the latest BSBI distribution map. And I think even the places where there are red dots rather than green ones, it's because the data hasn't been loaded onto the DDB yet. I think the plant is almost certainly still growing there without any problems. And so I thought, well, I'll just turn to the plant atlas and see what it has to say. And I was quite surprised to find that groundsel, I think this is groundsel, I've got the controls obscuring my screen, but yes, that's all right, was in decline. And I thought, well, that looks a bit odd. Let's have a look at the shepherd's purse. And that seems to be in an even worse state. It's zooming down in frequency. And that is totally contrary to sort of general experience. And so I looked at the change map that the atlas gives, and really there doesn't seem to be any change in the distribution. So what might be going on? Well, it might be related to recorder effort. We've been making a lot of effort to record all the scarcer things, but when you've got 100% coverage of something, you can't get any greater coverage. And it's rather like the economic models that want exponential growth. The Bank of England is mandated to keep inflation, i.e. growth, at 2%, but they don't seem to have been told that they need to grow the size of England at 2% every year. That would be great for us botanists because it would give us a lot more habitat to go out and explore. So what I did next was I looked at the list of the top 25 long-term decreases that the atlas lists. And I thought, well, I'll take a couple that I'm moderately familiar with. I'll look at Sinapis arvensis, charlock, and Scandex pectenveneris, partly because they both begin with S, but not for any other particular reason. So the charlock, that is certainly around where I live, pretty much ubiquitous. All you've got to do is disturb the ground and up it comes. The shepherd's needle is very much rarer, although it's doing very well in my garden at the moment. I have both plants in my garden, but the shepherd's needle is doing pretty well. So looking at the distribution maps, we see something quite different to what we saw with the groundsel and shepherd's purse. So particularly in the northwest, there's much less of the charlock, and for the shepherd's needle, that is very much a southern and eastern plant, at least in part, I think, looking at the sort of more chalky substrates that it may need. And then when we look at the BSBI distribution maps, again, that echoes the fact that the charlock is certainly less common and perhaps declining up here in the northwest. And by and large, the shepherd's needle is declining everywhere, even where what used to be relatively frequent. And I had thought that there might be some plants that would be relatively stable in population. And so I chose, initially selected 3 species. So along with the charlock, I thought, well, red-dead nettle and dove's hook cranesbill, they're fairly common. They should be everywhere. And it was quite interesting when I plotted out the distribution of these on this map of Cambridgeshire. So prior to 2003, a lot of the recording was in the south of the county, with only scattered recording in the north. Whereas today, at least in part thanks to Owen Manfort and Jonathan Graham's work on the Fenland flora, the coverage in the north is much greater. And this, I think, has moved the centre of recording northwards in our area. And that may be giving a change in the apparent distribution of some of these species. So it's something that we perhaps haven't taken into consideration when looking at change on a sort of more local level, that where you record is going to have an apparent influence on some of the frequencies. And historically, the fens were regarded as barren places with very little of interest. Thanks to that greater recording, we do now know that there are some interesting species up there. But by and large, thanks to the intensive agriculture, they are fewer in number than in the lighter soils of the chalk in the south. So the next thing to look at was indicator species. And again, Google had a view on what is an indicator species, and it reckoned that a plant indicator species are those plants that indicate the health of the environment in which they live. The presence or absence of these plants can help scientists understand the quality of the soil, water, or air. And one of the arable plant species indicators on a list that the BSBI has is Aphanes arvensis parsley peart, which is quite a tiny little plant, often overlooked, I think, but sometimes showing up more clearly because of a mildew that covers the surface of the leaf, making it just a little bit more obvious. And so this BSBI checklist of arable plant indicators has around 80 species on it. For me, some of them are relatively common. For example, the Aphanes arvensis is a pretty common species. Others are extremely rare, and so things like what's on this list, the Chenopodium murali is, which is one of the goosefoots, that's pretty rare, and others like Adonis annua, pheasant's eye, is regionally extinct. So there's a variety of local attributes to these. And the way to find out what you've got is to go out and look. And on occasion, you find a really nice arable margin with a whole host of interesting species on it. And this was a recent Cambridgeshire Flora group where the local estate was taking a great deal of care in providing a natural environment on its field margins. And that is quite an important concept that needs to be got across. Rather than introducing lots of species, make do with what you've got there, because although the plants are fairly obvious, what is less obvious are all the other things associated with the plants, the invertebrates, the birds that feed on those invertebrates and the plant seeds and so on. It can also be worth digitizing old records. And when I started in my botanical career as more or less a toddler, well, no, I think I'd probably be getting on for nearly a teenager by the time that this was pressed. Um, my mum certainly went out finding interesting plants, and it's interesting to find that this was the earliest record for that particular hectare. And it was only known about there because my mum had been out and collected it and pressed it. The other plant that I show here, Melanparum pratense, she had determined it as Sylvaticum, but I redetermined it as pratense. That still grows where she found it on Hope Mountain in Flintshire. So not far from the Cheshire border, but definitely in Wales. And I then used the database to show where these arable indicator species were found. And by and large, there are more of them in the south and east than there are in the north and west. And interestingly, Cambridge seemed to be a bit of a hotspot, which was a slight surprise, but something to follow up on. So I decided next thing is to step down and see what the distributions are on my local patch. And here I've used a color coding to show the number of these indicator species in each monad of the county. And just as in the global map, there's that clear concentration around Cambridge. At least some of that is going to reflect recorder effort. It's much easier to go out and find things on your doorstep than it is travelling further into the fens. You can also see that there's quite a few places with no records at all. That in part is that despite the fens being now well recorded at a tetrad level, at a monad level, there's still plenty of gaps where interesting species might lurk. And I should say with some of these slides, I've just put in a pretty picture of a plant that we might have seen on some of the Cambridgeshire Flora Group outings. And this particular one is, again, one of the threatened plants of England, henbane, which we found on a rather weedy arable field in the north of the county. So another source of how things are doing are red data lists, and we have those for England and Wales, but I think not yet for Scotland, so that's something that needs to be worked on. And also Plant Life have made a list of plants that they consider as really important arably. They've made use of those red lists and given the highest scores to those that are critically endangered and regionally extinct, and lower scores as you go down. And all of these added together, you can work out whether you've got an important arable plant area. And they've also produced an ID guide to some of these species. So first of all, they have a detailed table that lists some of them and has slightly different scores for Great Britain as a whole and for Wales and so on. And it's all arranged in alphabetical order, and each individual plant gets a species score. So I think some of these might get changed recently because, for example, corncockle Agrostemma gethargo is widely used in wildflower mixes So although its native area, as it were, or as an archaeophyte, has declined, it's certainly doing quite well where it's introduced. Whereas nobody really introduces plants like Anthemis cotula, the stinking chamomile. And so that is certainly still vulnerable in all three areas. And what's this doing now? So Plant Life drew up a broad brush characterization of the important arable plant areas based on records in the BSBI database. And clearly that shows this concentration of sites in that broad swathe across mostly southern England. And that pretty much matches what they did in the administrative Cambridgeshire area, again using tetrad data. And again, that's showing that Cambridge itself has a fairly high concentration. As I mentioned, they produced a really nice identification guide. I think this, at least in part, was targeted at farmers, and I'll show you why targeting farmers was important in a little bit. And they used really beautiful illustrations from the wildflowers of the British Isles by Garrard and Streeter. And so here's two of those threatened species, the pheasant's eye, the Adonis annua, and the prickly poppy, which used to be Papaver argemini and is now Rameria argemini. So some of these have changed their names. And by looking at the total score for a site, you get a measure of its importance. And scoring over a period of 20 years is recommended, or at least suggested, because in any one year, the conditions may not be suitable for the germination of some of these species. And so you can have mass germination years for some species, and then nothing in following years. But what they don't say is how many plants count towards a score. And so it might be a single plant is permissible to count, or it might be that you actually need a population. And the score that you have to reach depends a little bit on the soil type. So by and large, you need a higher score on the dry calcareous soils than you do on heavier clay soils. And just looking at one or two of these species, some are in decline, others are not doing so badly. So this is one of the prettier plants that you might find on a field margin, field madder, and certainly locally this is slightly increasing. And so what I did was I took the various lists and put them together into a table for Cambridgeshire. So I've got the BSBI list, the Plant Life list with its scoring system. I've also got the county status, which is based on my Register of Plants of Conservation Concern, which is put together in a very similar way to how Mark put his London Rare Plant Register together. The England status from the England Red List, and then a column for the number of monads that the particular plant has been seen in ever, and then the number of recent monads. And by using an effort weighting, I've given a percentage change. So some plants have increased enormously. So the parsley peat in particular seems to have done exceedingly well in recent years. And I can't think of any particular reason for that. It was suggested in the atlas that it's because we can better distinguish between parsley peat and slender parsley peat, but we don't have much of the latter in Cambridgeshire, so it probably shouldn't have made much of a difference. And it may just be another indicator of climate change. Another one that seems to have increased, or pair that have increased, are the two oriches or atriplexes, Atriplex patula and prostrata. And both of those have shown an enormous increase. And again, I don't quite see why that should be a case. It might be because we're looking more at the fens nowadays. It might be because they quite like salted road verges, or it might just be random chance. Whereas other things are clearly not doing so well. The pheasant's eye, that is listed as regionally extinct. We haven't seen that for a long time. And other things like the dense silky bent Aper interrupter, that's down to 95%. So it's definitely endangered at our local level. So of the species on the overall list, 20 have never occurred in Cambridgeshire, as far as I can determine. 14 are regionally extinct. 62 have declined, 11 show no change, but 48 have increased. So not all arable species are necessarily on the way out. But 9 species have declined by more than 90%, and all of those are now rare or scarce, and 30 have declined by more than 50%. One of the plants on the list is mousetail, and this is really a tiny little plant. I hadn't really appreciated quite how tiny it was until I saw it for myself, or discovered it for myself at a site for the first time. And I think that's a 5p piece that is down there as a bit of a background. And certainly in Cambridgeshire, it's more a plant of seasonally flooded, disturbed ground. And most of our records are from fenland cattle grazed washes rather than from arable fields. So that is definitely one of the county endangered species, and it is, as it's only now found in 9 monads, it's a county scarce species as well. Some plants are targets for reintroduction. So corn buttercup was part of Plant Life's Colour in the Margin project, and they tried an introduction at the RSPB Hope Farm. And it's doing okay in 1 or 2 places, but is definitely struggling in most. Historically, there were a few records from protected road verge surveys in 2002, and my suspicion is that they were actually probably Ranunculus bulbosus rather than Ranunculus arvensis. Anthemis cotula, stinking chamomile or stinking mayweed, can be quite frequent on some of our field margins. And with a bit of practice, you can pick it out amongst the scentless mayweed. I think because it has a slightly neater flower, and it also, to me, appears slightly whiter in colour. Now, if you can have whiter than white, that's an interesting concept. But I do know that my 2 eyes see colours slightly differently. One sees things with a slightly yellowish cast, and the other sees things with a slightly bluish cast. And maybe that's an individual's colour vision that enables them to pick up some of these very, very faint differences. Some of the other species in this group share similar preferences, that are the sort of light soils on chalk and are often found together. So for us, at least, the dense flowered fumitory, Fumaria densiflora, Fumaria parviflora, the Venus looking glass, Lagusia hybrida, and the 2 prickly poppies, Ramira gemini, the true prickly poppy, and the Ramira hispida, the rough poppy. They often occur as a group in the same place. Night flower and catch fly we mostly see in small quantity, Silene noctiflora, but there do seem to be occasions when you get a mass emergence. And we've had a couple of these. Once was in a new development near Cambridge, and another was near the Devil's Ditch in an arable field. And this was the site near Cambridge. There were literally thousands of plants creating a pink haze to a field. We know it was sown with the cornflower, Centaurea cyanus, but as far as the Wildlife Trust who now manage this area are concerned, there was no indication in the seed mix that the night flowering catchfly was there. So it is assumed that it came out of the seed bank and that conditions must have been exactly right for it to produce this mass emergence. One newly defined species, which I was quite surprised to discover on the DDB, is one that used to be a form of what was then Anagarus arvensis, is now Lysimachia arvensis, the scarlet pimpernel. And it's now got its own species name, Lysimachia leflingii. And some sources call this the blue pimpernel, but the true blue pimpernel is now Lysimachia femina. So I suggest that this should be called the azure pimpernel. And that is really quite a rare arable species. We've got a few records of it around Cambridge, but by and large, it's not very common in England. But it is definitely one worth looking out for, and is quite an obvious thing when you spot it amongst all the other scarlet pimpernels. There's a few species that may apparently be in decline due to recorder biases of one sort or another. And so this map shows the distribution of Italian ryegrass and the hybrid with ordinary ryegrass. And for us in Cambridgeshire, the hybrid is much more common than the Italian ryegrass. And that seems to be true for one or two other areas as well. And it may be possibly a case of mistaken identification, that not every ryegrass with awns is Italian ryegrass. And so the one on the right is what I would call certainly the hybrid. The one on the left, where you can see there are a lot more florets, I would say is the true Italian ryegrass. Another very strongly declining plant, or apparently declining plant, is Good King Henry. It's now Bleatum Bonus Henricius. It used to be Chenopodium Bonus Henricius, so it tells you it's a goosefoot. And a lot of the illustrated books show the leaf, which looks exactly the same as spear leaf orach, the Atriplex prostrata. And the textbooks also say that the Chenopodium grows on road verges. And I think that has certainly led to some surveyors, where it's been seen on protected road verges, misidentifying the plant. And really what you have to do is wait until later in the year when the plants are seeding, because the Atriplexes have angular fruits, while the Chenopodium have much more rounded ones. And that is a much easier way of telling the two apart. So reverting back to our Cambridgeshire map showing the exciting monads, and just illustrating it with one of the nice high-scoring arable species. What I did then was plot the data on a cumulative frequency. So there's an awful lot of monads with very few interesting species, and very few monads with a lot of interesting species. So I thought it was worth looking at those monads with a lot of interesting species to see whether they were worthy of greater attention. So I made a table listing them all, um, and at the top I've got a number of the database arable species in the monad, then the number of species from my Register of Plants of Conservation Concern, again in the monad, what the plant life, important arable plant area score was, just using the last decade, the overall score since 1985, and what existing and potential designations there might be for the monad as a whole. So, as I mentioned previously, the Cambridgeshire Register of Plants of Conservation Concern is effectively an expanded rare plant register that includes all plants that have a threat status and also all plants that are in trouble in the local area. And mine is just a fairly simple list. So it's relatively straightforward to do an annual update. But as soon as you've done an update, it goes out of date. And so there's already been a change of name for a hawkweed, and a rare dandelion has been added to it. So just looking at designations, that the sort of top designation for a site is a site of special scientific interest, at least in the specific site sense. We've also got special areas of conservation and things like that. But here I'm just going to cover what is mostly smaller sites. A step down is a county wildlife site, or perhaps in some counties, a local wildlife site. Something that might get designated in the future as a potential county wildlife site. Then for Cambridge City itself, we have city wildlife sites, and then there are also local nature reserves, some of which may be important, others which are definitely just of local interest. So here we've got a county wildlife site. This is an old chalk pit which supports very nice plants such as our chalk eyebright, Euphrasia pseudokerneri, and autumn gentian. In the past, around the margin of the pit, there's been a number of arable plant indicator species recorded, but today there's probably not sufficient disturbance for that to be considered as a site specifically for arable species. This is a city wildlife site that again gets quite a moderate important arable plant area score. It's mostly there because it's a grassland site and has plants like hoary plantain. But nevertheless, there are occasions when soil is disturbed for burials and the like, and that's how it gets its plant life score. East Pit, the Cherry Hinton Pits complex, have had a lot of disturbed ground in the past, and that's given rise to quite a high score. The pits also have a large number of species of Cotoneaster, and you may have listened to James Commons' talk on Cotoneasters as an introduction. If you're in the south of England, this is a really good spot to come and spot the Cotoneasters, but do listen in to James's talk and any of the other ones that are on the BSBI YouTube channel. So just looking at some of these sites, first of all, I'm going to look at TL4258 in the West Cambridge area. That is one on the heavier clays. These are the Galt clays. And if you go walking on the clays in the wet weather, your Wellington boots or even walking boots soon start weighing a huge amount as the clay sticks to them. But there is plenty of chalky influence as well, so they're not particularly acidic clays, they're alkali clays. And there are quite a number of designated sites in the area. In the north, there's the Traveller's Rest Pit. That's actually designated for its geology. There are some sites that are designated for their scrub value. Adams Road Sanctuary is actually designated now for its invertebrate species. So that was something different. And specifically designated for its plants is the private site of Trinity College Meadows. So there's nothing here that is obviously designated for its arable species, but as it happens, along the field margins in this area between the Coton Path hedgerow and the hedgerows east of the M11, they do have a wide variety of these arable plant indicators. And one of them is the yellow vetchling, a really pretty looking plant. And that used to grow along with the slender tear, which is now Villa, and it used to be Vixia parviflora, but it's moved. And that used to grow along what was the Coton footpath. And this is a picture taken some years ago. You can see all the cow parsley and quite a lot of charlock growing on the disturbed ground when the hedge on the right was put in by the university. Now, unfortunately, the City Council decided that this needed to be mown on a regular basis, and they usually mowed it when everything was in peak flower. And that, plus the hedge growing, has changed it completely. And so the yellow vetchling has not been seen there now for getting on for a decade. And unless there's a lot of work done to the hedge and perhaps a bit more disturbance of the ground, it won't come back. However, the arable margins are definitely still there, but one of the problems is that contract farmers very often want to spray right up to the field margin, even though there's a public footpath running alongside it and pedestrians might be walking along it. And I did have one of these come and spray within really a couple of meters of where I was walking. So that is not really a good outlook, and it does need a better vision for the countryside. But some species are doing okay there. This is one of the two fluellins. This is the round-leaved fluellin, Kixia spuria, and its partner, the sharp-leaved fluellin, Kixia elatini. And they come up occasionally on the margins, as does dwarf spurge, Euphorbia exigua. And usually in this picture, it's not on the field margin. It's probably one of our chalk pit sites where it's come up adjacent to the Blackstonia, which is really quite unusual. The broadleaf spurge does come up occasionally, often on bits of disturbed ground and disturbed track and so on, mostly in very small quantities. And then one of the rarer ones now in the south is spreading hedge parsley, Torulus arvensis. When I checked this in that field margin site earlier this year, I could only find one plant of it, whereas it used to do quite a lot better. However, in the county as a whole, we found that it seems to really enjoy fenland banks. And so in the north of the county, it's doing really well. Another site that the quick look survey identified was TL4558 in the centre of Cambridge. And clearly that's not really going to have much in the way of arable fields. But what it does have is my garden. And here I've got my little arable weeds bed. And most of the greenery that you can see in the centre of that is the shepherd's needle, which is really thriving in this particular spot. There's also a little bit of the corncockle that I originally sowed in, but that is very much declining. And despite getting all the seeds from one year's spread, it seems to be doing less and less well. Another potential site was this area here. Again, not much in the way of arable fields there, but there is the Cambridge University Botanic Garden. And plants that are in one bed, where it's a systematic bed, don't necessarily stay in their systematic bed. And this was one really nice one that jumped to somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be. This is the Ajuga comitris, the ground pine. And it was the first time I'd ever seen it as a live plant. So it was really quite spectacular looking. And to be honest, nothing like what I'd imagined that it would look like in the wider countryside. But this one we haven't seen in the wider countryside for some time. But on the field margins on the chalk, where the soil is very thin, there are still quite a few interesting species. For example, the basil thyme, Clinopodium acinos, and that can do in some places really quite well. So looking to the future, what are the sorts of threats? Well, there's this desire to have quick results and sow in a wildflower mix. We should definitely not be doing that. We should try and let what is there naturally re-emerge by making sure that the habitat is managed correctly. There's also lots of desire to plant trees everywhere. There's our changing agricultural practices. There's actually quite a lot of misinformation that we can increase biodiversity by doing this, that, or the other. There's the threat of invasive species, both native invasives and alien invasives, and there's climate change. So I'm going to just have a look at one or two of those. Modern agricultural practices very often create agricultural deserts, where on a footpath there is just bare ground and no weeds whatsoever. But not all farmers take the ultimate spraying to extremes. Here's another footpath in the same sort of setting, but in this one there is plenty of charlock that's come up. So certainly in Cambridgeshire, the charlock is not a threatened plant despite its extreme decline. Tree planting, this isn't actually an arable field, but it was quite an interesting disturbed ground field. There's the feeling that planting lots of trees will help climate change. Well, you've got to plant a tree every 20 seconds, really, to have much effect. And so what we definitely need to be doing is changing what we do rather than planting trees, but it makes us feel better by planting a tree. Equally, we need to transfer from burning coal and oil, and solar panels and wind turbines are thought to be a good way out of that. And there has been a recent study that shows that solar farms are much better than intensive agriculture for birds in particular. So if they've got a bit more in the way of hedgerows and a bit more in the way of grassland, birds do a lot better. But what about all those arable plants and invertebrates? Are they doing better? Well, almost certainly not. So we're getting rid of a lot of our long-standing biodiversity by not looking at the overall picture. And these systems promise real biodiversity net gain. It depends how you're doing your counting. And certainly in my view, providing beet hotels, log piles, and bird and back boxes is not necessarily managing the countryside in a sustainable way. Even agencies that are dedicated to maintaining wildlife sites have other considerations. So our local wildlife trust has brought a big stretch of arable land alongside one of our chalk grassland sites. And the vision is to turn this back into chalk grassland. It is, however, a really good site and an important arable plant area. So perhaps there needs to be a consideration of what does best for the overall biodiversity. And I promised I wouldn't diverge too far from botany, and you might wonder why I've included a picture of a venerable telescope with a comet hanging in the sky above it. And the reason is that for nearly 50 years, I've been taking temperature measurements on the north-facing wall of that observatory building. And this shows quite an interesting change. Here I've plotted the mean annual weekly maximum temperature and the mean annual weekly minimum temperature. And both have increased. The mean maximum has increased more or less in line with the climate change quoted statistics. So perhaps 1.5 degrees or so rise. But the mean minimum has increased by much more. And this is largely on account of the warmer atmosphere, holding more water vapor and making skies more cloudy. There are also going to be non-climate related changes due to changes in activity around the site. But by and large, the pattern is replicated in more controlled temperature measurements around the country. And this does matter for plants, that for many species, you need cold winter conditions in order to promote germination and also to reduce competition from plants that can grow in slightly warmer conditions. So as we're no longer seeing those sharp, hard frosts to the same extent, that is going to change the composition of the flora of arable margins. There are some organisations, however, that do specifically manage for the arable species, and Plant Life has two roles. It manages a farm, but it also provides advocacy to farmers, and farmers in particular do need somebody to interpret what the government tells them. And so on the Ranscombe farm, there are a lot of these declining arable species, and there is a BSBI field meeting to the farm, which may well be getting fully booked by now, but that's on June the 14th. So do make bookings for our field meetings. They will let you see a wide variety of wonderful species. So as part of the government's environmental land management schemes, they do offer farmers various subsidies which are conducive to arable species. So having overwintering stubbles definitely helps some species. And then you can have increased activity for specifically threatened species. And there is also one specific scheme for providing cultivated areas for arable plants. And then you start looking at the fine print, and it says you can get this money if there's evidence or records exist for important arable plants. See Plant Life YAPA classification 4 and above, see the appendix. Now, the problem is that the poor farmer won't be able to find that document because it's no longer on the Plant Life webpage. Fortunately, I did keep a copy of it before it disappeared. So locally, at least, I can tell farmers what's on it and what plants matter to them. And this is the scoring list that I showed earlier. Another positive thing for the future may be that plants do evolve. And certainly locally, one of the agricultural pests has been blackgrass, Alopecuris myoceroides, and farmers started just spraying their crops to get rid of it. And lo and behold, it evolved herbicide resistance so that sometimes you see almost as much black grass in a field of wheat as you do the wheat. Now, wouldn't it be really wonderful if some of our other threatened arable species evolved the same resistance, and that they might then come back to repopulate the cornfields? So what do we need you to do? Well, one thing is to record where you see these arable plant species so that we can start to identify which are the most important margins. And the new BSBI recording app, along with things like iRecord, are going to be really useful tools in doing this. And I think it is going to revolutionize our botanical studies by knowing exactly where some plants grow. Otherwise, we may need an asteroid coming in and smashing the Earth to not quite smithereens, but resetting the clock. And there has been in the news recently this asteroid 2024 YR3, I think it's called, which at one time had a 3% chance of hitting the Earth in about a decade's time. Sadly, or just as well, that risk is now reduced to far less than 1%, although the chance of it hitting the moon is actually now greater than its chance of hitting the Earth. But I think even if we manage to destroy most of our arable loved species, there is a chance that they will survive because we still have neglected areas that get turned over from time to time. And I've used this illustration before to illustrate a case where a civilization may have used up all its natural resources, but nevertheless, the living species of plants remain. And I think plants are adaptable, and no matter what we do to them, I think we'll still have them about, but we will lose some on a local level. And that will be a shame because many of these species are so beautiful that they are a delight to anybody that sees them. And so that's where I'm going to finish. And it's time for questions. And I'm not quite sure who's going to take over and ask me any questions.
I can have a look through the chat.
Okay, thanks, Sam, if you'd be willing to do that.
So just someone saying that mouse tail highlighting a population of very tall ones growing in optimal conditions. Not a question. Hannah Gibbons saying worth noting that the move from ploughing to minimum tillage or direct drilling may well also have negative effects on arable plants, largely as they also involve the use of lots of herbicides and less ground disturbance. And also Hannah highlighting the Colour the Margins website is still up and running and has lots of useful arable plant resources. Other than that, there's no questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our session, unless anybody else wants to say anything. Oh, there's a new message.
Just popped up. Has Natural England been involved in the campaign against busways, e.g. cotton? I don't fully understand that one, but maybe you do.
This is a local thing, I think, where there is a plan to put a guided busway through an old orchard. And as far as I know, because it's only a county site, then Natural England wouldn't be involved with something like that. So it would have to be a triple SI before Natural England has a specific concern, unfortunately.